do you want to reintroduce yourself and explain who you are?
Yes, I have a bit of an eclectic background. I am quite, if we go about this terminology, rather virginal to critical minerals. My introduction to minerals started about 2 years ago when I was invited to be part of the Lightbridge project, which is a public-private alliance in the US, tasked by the US government to devise basically a resilient lithium supply chain for the batteries. And that was interesting exposure because I was brought in under the geopolitical angle to help kind of like navigate that process. And I had this incredible exposure to private sector, the struggles of the private sector to navigate the new environment in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, this huge influx of money, which is also coming with new types of conditionalities. And the need to operate in a new environment, which is basically marked by geopolitics. So suddenly, the private sector has to deal with things that they were never prepared, equipped, or trained or expected to do, which is basically navigate the geopolitics and trying to comply to all these conditionalities, which are pretty still minimum in the US comparing to what's happening, for example, in European Union or the UK, but still quite a big task. And that has really intrigued me because I have this background of the security and the geopolitics and public policy. And even though I worked on Brexit, etc., it really exposed me to, when I worked on the COVID response with the UK government, it exposed me to the fragility of the supply chains. It was actually really shocking. So when I was as part of the Tasma International colleagues that we worked together on this USAID Jet Green Minerals challenge, what really struck me is that fighting COVID, it has so many similarities with the critical minerals. You have everyone chasing the same thing at the same time from a limited number of suppliers, and those who are bigger and richer are just throwing money at the issue, while those who don't are just going to miss out on everything. But throwing money doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get in return the quality product, which we know from the pandemic experience has happened the same. So these similarities really just show how fragile our supply chains are, how inability to understand the geopolitics, which are becoming the norm, and not really knowing how to utilize the information and data, which is overwhelming everyone, to actually make these assumptions, how to manage your risks along the whole value chain. So that's kind of a little bit of a mixed background how I came to introduce this, and I became very intrigued, and I'm very happy to be part of this conversation and this sector because it's very interesting.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Miran. And I think just to get us rolling with this conversation, so the title that you gave for our little chat now was When Open Meets Digital, Navigating Corruption Risk Along the Critical Minerals Value Chain. And just to start with, what do you actually mean when you say open meets digital? What's this concept all about?
Well, following on the previous one, we're all about terminology. And if I may say to begin with, we don't only have critical minerals, we have green minerals and we have transitional minerals. So Global Witness calls them transitional minerals, the US government calls them green minerals, and the rest of us are calling them critical minerals. So the open meets digital goes back to my doctoral research at the London School of Economics. I was basically focusing on open and digital data to understand and predict UK government policy, which we can all agree was in recent years very difficult to do. So it's very easy to say, oh, let's just use open sources and let's just use digital data to understand what's happening. When you say open, that doesn't necessarily mean the information you're going to get is going to be in a digital format. But also it has to mean that basically you have no restrictions in accessing that information, which means there is no paywall and there is no government restriction for you obtaining that information. When you say digital data, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be open information. And more importantly, it doesn't mean it's going to be reusable. So I coined this term of when open meets digital, It means that that information is accessible to everyone with access to the internet, and it's in a digital format that's reusable. So basically, it's a methodology framework that a company, an organization, a government, an NGO can adopt to start filtering this noise around us to make sense what is happening and how they can extract the value. So it is one of the methodologies that we can use that I try to contextualize by really setting a very firm framework within which you can operate more effectively.
Awesome. So with that then, I guess in terms of this resource that is those data sets that you're referring to, if we focus in on corruption risk, what are some of the main obstacles that you think you might find when trying to extract value from this open digital data?
Well, I think it can be two clusters, and they're both operating in echo chambers. The first one is if you say, okay, we're going for this open meets digital. So how do we select these sources? Which sources are relevant? Which ones we can trust? And third one, if we select those that are relevant and trustworthy, are they going to be regularly updated so that there is a kind of a long-term sustainable value for us using that? And the problem with the trustworthy source these days, there's so much misinformation, there's so much, I say, fake news, but there's also different agendas. In this kind of a geopolitical game, you know, the Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, the Europeans, the fossil fuel industry all have the agendas they want to kind of influence the government, the media, and the politics. So how do you really narrow down what you think it's a trustworthy source? Somebody has already mentioned this whole issue of misinformation already, because if you have someone saying something you don't agree with, it doesn't mean it's a fake news. It just means it's a certain agenda and ideology. So if you're providing an analysis and information of that data for many other organizations to make decision, you know, make evidence-based decision process based on that, you really have to create your methodology to be very robust. So you can't operate in an echo chamber. Even if you disagree with that agenda or the ideology, you have to take it into the account and explain it to those who need that information so they can understand why suddenly in one country there is such resistance to electric vehicles, because maybe somebody has a very organized campaign against that product to be developed because it goes against their interests. So the first part is that the data source, how you deal with that. The second part is the people within your organizations who are actually working with the data and information. From my background with the government, I know that the public servants or the civil servants were so petrified of data. They were not trained in it, and they all think you need to have a specialized technical knowledge or know how to use very complex software or actually be a data scientist to engage with it, which is completely incorrect. You really have to be able to understand what's your vision with this information? How can you extract information from your daily work and then translate that to people who are data scientists, the researchers, the communicators, and then designers? And usually they all work in their own echo chambers. They don't talk, and they don't necessarily know how to talk to each other. So you basically say, here's some data, I've contextualized, and designer can make the best out of it without explaining to them actually what to do. At the end, you get these very elaborate data visualizations that we all find very exciting, but after a minute or two of looking at them, you don't really understand what that visualization is telling you. So your first kind of I capture your attention doesn't really retain your attention because you're not getting any value out of that. So I think that is the problem for most of the organizations, that people are too afraid to deal with data, and they just outsource that to somebody who's too technical, but doesn't necessarily know how to communicate, or doesn't understand the politics, or doesn't understand to explain to the designer that misusing a color can completely change the perception of what that is in a geopolitical terms. So I think those two echo chambers of technical expertise and selecting your sources are the kind of two major elements that are constantly in conflict.
So what I'm hearing is something that on one hand is truly terrifying, just to share that with you from my perspective, but on the other hand is a massive opportunity. And I know that you've been developing a dashboard approach, is that correct, to corruption risk? And this was part of the winning team within the USA Jet Green Minerals Challenge. Is that correct?
I know it's a big title, isn't it? When I was at the OECD, I really struggled to do the elevator pitch. Yeah, there's myself and 4 other colleagues as part of Talisman International. We come from different backgrounds: diplomacy, military, security, geopolitics, public policy, AI, and data scientists. So we really are a quick mix. We applied for it, and we were one of the winners. There's about 10 winners at the end. It was last year, the challenge. We started work a couple of months ago. We're working on a prototype. We understood that as these conditionalities and the anti-corruption compliance and the risk increases, the companies are really struggling to get enough information for either their due diligence or the risk life cycle management. At the same time, as you're asking more from them to accomplish, they have a stronger argument saying, we don't have enough information. This is taking too much of our resources. Therefore, we can't do it in such a detail. So the idea was like, if you have a data dashboard where we would present different types of information that is relevant for you to assess different levels of corruption risks along the lithium. Well, we chose, basically, this is a prototype. So we chose lithium as a mineral. We chose Chile as a host country, and we focused on upstream domain just to start testing some of our ideas and theories. So this is where the process is now, focusing mostly on the benefit of the downstream companies who have more bargaining power to say down the stream that you really need to correct certain behaviors if you want us to procure your lithium or the lithium-based products. So the dashboard idea is there to basically streamline your interest in information that can help you make certain decisions, rather than you going all over the place trying to figure out which open government portal in Chilean government can give you this information, which indicator can give you a sense what is happening on kind of a social welfare domain within the Chilean society, that you have a one-stop shop to basically understand what is happening, how you can utilize that information, and get a quick user-friendly analysis, which otherwise would take so much time, and you will not have any more justifications. If such tools like this exist, the companies will not have justifications to say they were not able to accomplish the task, or they were not aware that certain things were happening. So it's a kind of an intermediary position where you're not taking the public or the private side, but you're basically allowing them to use the information in a structural way, but also allow them to use it for their own purpose. Maybe they can go back and see something that we haven't seen, which kind of fits their own context. So we're at that stage, and we've recently done a survey with the US-based companies, mostly downstream, what they would like most to see from these kind of tools. An interesting thing was, even though we were discussing its corruption, the top risk they were seeing all throughout was geopolitics. And there is a tendency to separate geopolitics from corruption risk. And those two are intervened because the geopolitical tools to get what you want for your state basically uses corruption as a vehicle to achieve that. So there is a lot of problems of separating the two as a kind of a completely different elements that don't coexist in the same domain, which is then just creating more and more problems.
Super interesting. With all of that, Milan, do you, in terms of going back to the data types, so alternative data as a concept? So I mean, this is something that I think is within a lot of policy debates, for example, at the moment. But again, people are still perhaps struggling with regards to, is it good, is it bad, etc. From your perspective, how do you define alternative data? And do you think it is useful for companies to involve in their data analysis, etc., when they're making decisions?
Oh, it's a definitely buzzword you want to tell to your CEO and a minister. They would just love that. And only has become a buzzword because I have to go back to COVID. The alternative data is not this kind of a miraculous, in my opinion, miraculous new source that has never been discovered before. These data sources exist, but they have never been utilized in a kind of a mainstream application. And they were never seen as a very kind of a sexy data, if we want to talk in that world. The COVID experiment has shown, if you can all remember, and I was there because I worked on COVID response, using sewage water to detect the virus in the community and the mutations and the disposable water from the airplanes from where the virus is coming is basically the first evidence of how alternative data concept went mainstream, because everybody understood that. From the chief executive to the minister to the ordinary public, it was a very simple message how we were able to use data from something that was there, only utilized in a niche area by the people working in the sewage plant, suddenly mainstreamed to work in public health and protect the society. So that's how the alternative data really penetrated that whole kind of a public and media domain. And it's always used as an example for people to understand what do you think, what are you talking about? It is basically using something that is so not directly connected to your regular work, completely outside that perimeter, but is providing you with the evidence that you can predict certain things, or you can construct a new meaning for your work that you're currently working on. That is basically what alternative data is. And one example to the critical minerals, which I came up with, was regarding the building of the gigafactories in the US battery belt. When you look for the locations for the gigafactories, but basically for the batteries for the electric vehicles that contain critical minerals, you're assessing your location, which has to have everything from infrastructure to the electricity supply, etc. And one thing in that area where these gigafactories are being built are extreme weather conditions. There's a lot of hurricanes. So you know you're going to have a hurricane hitting that area, but you have to know how much damages they're going to possibly do to your gigafactory and your electric supply. And in order to discover these alternative things, you have to be an eclectic reader, you have to think creatively, and you have to be very innovative. I read a very obscure article in a local newspaper in Texas about the power outage in Texas during the freeze last, I think it was 2 years ago. And a paragraph within that obscure article gave me indications that the local authorities in the United States are responsible for trimming the trees along the power lines. And there is a data set that tells you how progressive each local authority is in trimming their trees, which means that if you have extreme weather condition, whether the tree is going to fall on the power lines and physically damage your infrastructure, which basically can tell you how quickly can you recover from such extreme weather condition and repair your electricity supply. That is an alternative data source that can help you understand your risks and your resilience. So that's another example how you can find that. You can't push yourself to find one. It has to be logical in a way, and you have to be creative how you see that data that nobody else sees that it can be applied for something like that. That's basically the mix of it. And it's quite interesting, but it can become very nerdy in a way, but quite effective if you really get it.
Don't worry, I don't think it's nerdy at all. And actually, I know that a lot of, for example, the geoscientists that are listening into this at the moment, we're going, yeah, we use those kind of data sets the entire time because we can't get to the real proof, as it were, because those rocks are often a long way below the surface. So instead, we're using perhaps alternative data sets to give us the proxies or the vectors to say, okay, what do we think might be going on there? Awesome. Miran, do you have any final words of wisdom you would like to share with us before we wrap up?
Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of interacting with data. You don't have to be a data scientist. I think you have to have a bit of a vision, how you see that final output, what you want to accomplish with, and then surround yourself with people who have technical knowledge that will help you deliver that. I think that is the main obstacle for a lot of people to kind of embrace this. And at the end of the day, it's an essential thing, because if you're tapping in the dark and you don't even know what your risks are, this kind of open meets digital can help you give this kind of a macro signals, and you can suddenly see certain patterns that you never considered that they're happening within a certain period or the location, and they're repetitive, and it can really help you mitigate some of those risks. So try to surround yourself with multidisciplinary team like we did at Talisman. It really works.
Awesome. We love a bit of multidisciplinary action. Absolutely fantastic. Everyone, please put your hands together for the fantastic Miran. Excellent.
Thanks.